Welcome back to Wild West Stories, where survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about fighting for the life you deserve to live, no matter how impossible the odds seem against you. Picture this. It's the brutal winter of 1882 in the Colorado Territory, and a young Mexican-American woman named Elena Martinez is being dragged through a howling blizzard by two ruthless hired guns. A rough burlap sack covers her head, thick rope binds her hands behind her back, and her feet are going completely numb in the deep, merciless snow that seems determined to bury her alive. She's being taken to Hangman's Bluff, a treacherous cliff so deadly that no soul has ever survived the 300-foot fall to the jagged rocks below. But this isn't just another frontier murder, partner. This is a conspiracy that reaches deeper into the corrupt heart of Silver Creek than Elena ever could have imagined. A conspiracy involving her own stepfather, a power-hungry sheriff with blood on his hands, and a forced marriage arrangement that would make Elena disappear from this world forever. You see, Elena Martinez isn't just any woman in Silver Creek. She's an educated, independent school teacher who dared to say no to the most dangerous man in the territory. What Elena doesn't know yet is that the mysterious mountain man who's about to find her broken body in the snow isn't just some random hermit living rough in the wilderness. He's Samuel Garrett, a former U.S. Marshal carrying his own dark secrets, his own reasons for hiding from civilization, and his own burning desire for justice against the very same corrupt lawmen who are trying to murder her. Samuel has been watching Sheriff Donovan Kane for 3 long years, gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment to bring down the man who destroyed his life and killed his partner. This is the story of a woman who was supposed to die on that frozen cliff, but refused to stay dead. It's the story of a former lawman who thought redemption was impossible until he found someone worth fighting for. And it's the story of how 2 broken souls found the strength to fight back against the evil that tried to destroy them both, proving that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes a foundation for the best thing that ever happens to you. So settle in, partner, because you're about to hear a tale of betrayal and survival, of love found in the harshest wilderness, of justice served cold as mountain snow, and of the unbreakable will to survive when everything seems lost. This is Elena Martinez's story, and it's one that will remind you that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision that something else is more important than fear. Get ready for a story that proves sometimes the mountain saves you so you can save others. The rope around Elena's wrists had been tied so brutally tight that her hands had lost all feeling hours ago. Through the scratchy burlap sack covering her head, she could hear the labored breathing of Sheriff Kane's hired killers as they dragged her relentlessly up the treacherous mountain path, their heavy boots crunching through snow that seemed to grow deeper and more merciless with every agonizing step. Elena Martinez had grown up hearing whispered stories about Hangman's Bluff. Every child in Silver Creek knew about the notorious cliff where problems had a way of disappearing forever, where accidents happened to folks who asked too many dangerous questions or crossed the wrong powerful men. But never in her darkest nightmares had she imagined that her own stepfather would take blood money to send her to that godforsaken place. The nightmare had begun just 4 days earlier, when Sheriff Donovan Kane made his intentions crystal clear. He wanted Elena as his wife, and Kane wasn't the type of man who gracefully accepted no for an answer. When Elena had refused his proposal publicly at the church social, telling half the town that she'd rather die than marry a man who beat defenseless animals and took bribes from every outlaw gang within 100 miles, Kane's face had turned dark as a thundercloud before a deadly storm. Elena Martinez wasn't just any woman in Silver Creek. As one of the few educated Mexican-American women in the territory, she taught school to children of all backgrounds and had earned respect through her intelligence and fierce independence. Her late mother, Maria Elena Santos, had been from a proud Mexican family that had owned vast lands before the territory changed hands. Her father, James Martinez, had been an Irish immigrant who'd loved Maria deeply and taught Elena to read, write, and think for herself. But when tuberculosis claimed both her parents within a year of each other, Elena had been forced to live with her stepfather, Diego Herrera, her mother's second husband. Diego was a weak, gambling man who saw Elena more as a burden than family. He ran a small trading post, but most of his money went to poker games and whiskey at the Lucky Dollar Saloon. Sheriff Kane had been watching Elena for months, and his interest wasn't romantic, it was predatory. At 35, Kane controlled Silver Creek through fear and corruption. He took payments from rustlers, looked the other way during robberies, and made certain problems disappear permanently. An educated, independent woman like Elena represented a threat to his absolute authority. If he could force her into marriage, he could control her, silence her, and claim her late mother's remaining land rights. "You sure this cliff is high enough, boss?" asked Jake Morrison, one of Kane's regular thugs, his voice barely audible over the howling mountain wind. "Girl ain't supposed to get back up from this one," came the gruff reply from Clint Rodriguez, the other hired killer. "Sheriff wants it looking like a proper accident. Senorita went for a walk in the snowstorm, got herself turned around, slipped right off the edge. Tragic loss for the whole community." Elena tried desperately to speak, to plead for her life, but the freezing mountain air had made her throat raw and painful. She'd been crying since they grabbed her from the schoolhouse that morning, since her stepfather Diego had turned his coward's back when she'd screamed his name in desperation. "Diego!" she'd called out in anguish. "Diego, please don't let them do this to me. I'm your family." But Diego Herrera had already counted Sheriff Kane's money. $75 for a stepdaughter who wouldn't marry the man who could make all of Diego's crushing gambling debts disappear forever. In Diego's weak mind, it was a bargain that solved all his problems. Eleanor remembered the exact moment when Kane had made his proposal, just 3 days after the Sunday church social. He'd arrived at the schoolhouse while she was cleaning the blackboard, his badge gleaming and his gun prominent on his hip. "Miss Martinez," he'd said with false politeness, "time we had ourselves a serious conversation about your future in this town." "I have nothing to discuss with you, Sheriff Kane," Elena had replied firmly, not turning around from the blackboard. "See, that's where you're wrong, senorita. This town needs stability, and a woman like you needs protection. I'm offering to make you my wife, give you a proper American name, a respectable position in society." Elena had turned slowly, her dark eyes flashing with controlled anger. "And if I refuse this generous offer?" Kane's smile had been cold as winter steel. "Well, I'd hate to see anything happen to that little schoolhouse of yours, or to Diego's trading license. Lot of dangerous elements in these mountains, Miss Martinez. A woman alone can face all kinds of unfortunate accidents. My answer is no, Sheriff Kane. Today, tomorrow, and forever." That's when Kane's mask had slipped completely. "You think being half Mexican gives you some kind of special protection? Think again, girl. I own this town, and I own everyone in it, including you." Now, as Jake and Clint dragged her the final agonizing yards to Hangman's Bluff, Elena felt the solid ground disappear beneath her feet. She was standing at the very edge of eternity, mountain snow swirling around her like the angry spirits of all the innocent people who had died on this cursed cliff before her. The wind was so fierce it seemed to be trying to tear her apart. 300 feet below, jagged rocks waited like the teeth of some ancient monster. Elena could hear the evil satisfaction in Jake's voice as he prepared to end her life. "Just push her over and let's get back to town," Jake snapped, flexing his stiff fingers. "It's colder than hell up here and I want to get back to my whiskey." Elena tried one final desperate time to scream, but the merciless mountain wind stole her voice away completely. Then came the brutal shove, sudden, vicious, final. She fell into the white void of certain death, the burlap sack whipping around her face as she plummeted toward what should have been the end of Elena Martinez's story. But sometimes, partner, the mountain itself has different plans. Far below, hidden in the wilderness and watching through a military spyglass, a lone figure had witnessed the entire murder attempt. Samuel Garrett, former U.S. Marshal turned mountain hermit, lowered his spyglass with grim determination. He'd been tracking Sheriff Kane's activities for 2 years, gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment to bring justice to Silver Creek. That moment had just arrived. Elena Martinez didn't die that terrible day, though she came close enough to feel death's cold breath on her face. 25 feet down the sheer cliff face, the burlap sack snagged on a gnarled pine branch that had somehow found purchase in the solid rock. The sudden jerk yanked her violently sideways, changing her trajectory just enough to save her life. Instead of smashing into the deadly rocks below, Elena crashed into a massive snowdrift that had accumulated over years on a narrow ledge jutting out from the cliff face. For what felt like eternity, Elena lay motionless in the deep snow. Every part of her body screamed in agony. Her left shoulder felt like it had been torn from its socket, dislocated or broken. She couldn't tell which through the waves of pain. Her ribs ached like she'd been trampled by wild horses. But incredibly, miraculously, she was still breathing. And where there was breath, there was hope. High above her, she could hear Jake and Clint's voices growing fainter as they walked away from the cliff, satisfied with their murderous work. They believed she was dead, which meant they wouldn't be searching for a body. That gave Elena precious time, if she could figure out how to use it before the mountain cold claimed her life. With her hands still bound tightly behind her back, Elena struggled desperately to remove the suffocating burlap sack. When she finally managed to pull it off her head, the world was a swirling blur of white and gray. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes that limited visibility to just a few feet. The temperature was dropping fast, and Elena realized with growing terror that she had maybe an hour before hypothermia set in, probably less given her injuries and wet clothes. She tried frantically to climb back up the cliff face, but her dislocated shoulder made any upward movement impossible. The ledge she'd landed on was only about 8 feet wide and ended in another deadly drop. She was trapped, badly hurt, and completely alone on a mountain where no rational person would ever think to look for her. That's when she heard a voice that would change everything. "Easy there, miss. Don't try to move too quick or you might fall right off that ledge." Elena spun around as fast as her injuries allowed, ignoring the spike of agony in her shoulder. A man was carefully climbing down to her ledge using a rope, moving with the confident grace of someone who knew these treacherous mountains like the back of his weathered hand. He was tall and powerfully built, with dark hair streaked with gray, and a full beard that hadn't seen a razor in many months. His clothes were practical and well-worn, the outfit of a man who lived rough in the wilderness, but knew how to survive. "Who are you?" Elena gasped through chattering teeth, fear and hope warring in her voice. "Name's Samuel Garrett," he said calmly, reaching the ledge and immediately kneeling beside her. "And you're about 15 minutes away from freezing to death, so we can handle introductions later." Samuel didn't ask her name or what had happened to her. He simply wrapped a thick bear fur around her shoulders and began examining her injuries with gentle but experienced hands. His touch was professional and careful, like someone who treated wounded people many times before. "Shoulders dislocated," he diagnosed quickly. "This is going to hurt something fierce, but I need to get it back in place before we move you." Before Elena could protest or prepare herself, Samuel gripped her arm and shoulder and popped the joint back into its proper position with one swift, expert motion. The pain was so intense that Elena nearly passed out, black spots dancing in her vision, but immediately she felt blessed relief. Her arm still ached terribly, but she could move it again. "Can you ride a horse?" Samuel asked urgently. "Ride what horse?" Elena managed to whisper. Samuel pointed to a narrow trail that Elena hadn't noticed before, probably because the falling snow had obscured it. There, waiting with the infinite patience of a well-trained animal, stood a magnificent mountain horse with a thick winter coat and intelligent dark eyes that seemed almost human. "Her name's Sage," Samuel explained as he carefully helped Elena to her feet. "She's got more common sense than most people I've known, and she knows these mountain trails better than anyone alive. She'll get us home safe. I promise you that." Home. The word hit Elena like a physical blow to her heart. She didn't have a home anymore. Diego had made sure of that when he'd sold her life for 75 pieces of silver. But Elena was too exhausted and hurt to argue or ask questions. She let Samuel help her onto Sage's strong back, settled behind him, wrapped her good arm around his waist, and allowed him to take her away from Hangman's Bluff where she was supposed to have died. As they rode through the swirling snow, Elena found herself studying the man who had saved her life. Samuel Garrett moved like a soldier or lawman, alert and aware of everything around them. His hands were scarred and calloused from hard work, but his voice was educated and intelligent. Everything about him suggested a man with a story, someone who'd seen violence and hardship but had retained his humanity. The ride to Samuel's cabin took over an hour through the worst blizzard Elena had ever experienced. Several times, she was certain they would get lost or fall off the narrow mountain trails, but Sage never hesitated or made a wrong step. The horse seemed to see paths that were invisible to human eyes. When they finally reached their destination, Elena was amazed by what she saw. Samuel's cabin was built into the side of a hill and surrounded by towering pine trees, making it practically invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. It was the perfect hiding place for someone who didn't want to be found by the outside world. "Almost there," Samuel called back to her as Sage picked her way down a final steep trail. "Just hold on a little longer." The inside of Samuel's cabin was simple but surprisingly comfortable and well organized. One large room served as living area, kitchen, and bedroom, with a magnificent stone fireplace that dominated one wall. The furniture was handmade but solid, and everything was clean and well maintained. Thick furs covered the floor, and shelves lined with books suggested that Samuel was far more educated than the typical mountain hermit. "You take the bed," Samuel said firmly as he helped Elena down from Sage. "I've got plenty of blankets, and I'll sleep by the fire tonight." Elena wanted to protest. She didn't want to take his bed, but exhaustion hit her like an avalanche. She collapsed onto the thick mattress, still wearing her wet, snow-covered clothes, and Samuel immediately covered her with warm quilts and fur blankets without making any attempt to undress her or take advantage of her helpless condition. It was the first genuine kindness anyone had shown her since her parents died. "Sleep," Samuel said gently. "You're safe here. We'll talk when you wake up." Elena tried to stay awake, tried to ask the 100 questions racing through her mind, but her body had reached its absolute limit. She fell into a deep, healing sleep while Samuel quietly tended the fire and stood guard over her safety. When Elena finally woke up, it was completely dark outside, and a cheerful fire was crackling in the stone fireplace. Samuel sat in a wooden chair nearby, carefully cleaning a well-maintained rifle. He'd changed into dry clothes and his hair was still slightly damp from washing. On a small table beside the bed, he'd placed a steaming cup that smelled like heaven. "How long was I asleep?" Elena asked, her voice still hoarse but stronger than before. "About 10 hours, Samuel replied, setting the rifle aside carefully. "Your body needed the rest after what you went through. Drink this. It's venison broth with wild herbs. You need to get some warmth back into your body." The broth was rich and nourishing, warming Elena from the inside out. As she drank, she studied her mysterious rescuer more carefully. Samuel Garrett looked to be in his late 30s, with the kind of deeply weathered face that came from years of outdoor living in harsh conditions. His hands were scarred and calloused from hard work, but his movements were precise and deliberate. Everything about him suggested a man who was used to taking care of himself and protecting others. But there was something else in Samuel's eyes, something that spoke of loss and old pain, carefully hidden beneath his calm exterior. "Why did you help me?" Elena asked directly, needing to understand. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, staring into the dancing flames. "Found a woman in the snow once before," he said finally, his voice heavy with old grief. "Didn't get to her in time. Been carrying that failure for 3 years now." Elena felt something twist in her chest, not pity, but understanding. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Wasn't your fault," Samuel said, standing and moving to the window to look out at the endless snow. "But it was mine. So when I saw those men dragging someone up to Hangman's Bluff, I figured I'd better pay attention this time." "You saw them take me?" Elena asked with surprise. "I see everything that happens on this mountain," Samuel explained. "It's part of staying alive up here, when you've got enemies looking for you." He turned back to face her, his expression serious. "They mentioned Sheriff Kane by name. That the man you were supposed to marry?" Elena's hands tightened around the warm cup, anger and fear warring in her voice. "Kane wanted to marry me to control me. I told him I'd rather die than be his wife. Apparently he decided to make that happen." "Donovan Kane is a dangerous, evil man," Samuel said grimly. "He's been taking bribes and making problems disappear for years. You're not the first person to cross him, but you might be the first to survive it." "What do you mean?" Elena asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. "I mean Kane's going to be very unhappy when he finds out you're still breathing," Samuel said. "And he's not the type of man who gives up easily. He'll keep coming until someone stops him permanently. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain cold outside. Then I guess I'd better make sure I'm ready for him when he comes. Samuel studied her face carefully, seeing something there that made him nod with approval. Yes, I believe you will be. But first you need to heal. And then, if you're willing, I'd like to teach you how to fight back. For the first time since this nightmare began, Elena Martinez felt something besides fear and despair. She felt hope, and more than that, she felt the beginnings of righteous anger. I'm willing, she said firmly. Teach me everything. Elena spent the next 3 weeks recovering in Samuel's mountain sanctuary, and during that time, she learned things about survival, strength, and herself that no church school or finishing academy had ever taught her. But more than practical skills, she discovered reserves of courage and determination she never knew existed within her heart. Samuel proved to be a patient but demanding teacher. Each morning began before dawn with physical exercises designed to rebuild Elena's strength after her injuries. He showed her how to move silently through deep snow, how to read weather patterns in the way wind moved through the pine trees, and how to find food and shelter in the harshest wilderness conditions. Survival isn't just about staying alive, Samuel explained one crisp morning as they practiced tracking deer through fresh snow behind the cabin. It's about staying strong enough to fight for the life you want to live. Out here, weakness gets you killed, but in town it gets you controlled by men like Cain. Elena proved to be a quick and determined student. Her Mexican heritage had given her a natural resilience, and her education made her analytical and strategic in her thinking. Under Samuel's guidance, she learned to shoot his rifle with deadly accuracy, to handle a knife for both defense and utility, and to read the intentions of dangerous men by watching their body language and listening to what they didn't say. But the most important lessons were about inner strength and self-worth. You're not the same woman who was thrown off that cliff, Samuel observed one evening as they sat by the fire, cleaning their weapons after a long day of training. That woman was afraid and alone. This woman is dangerous. Elena smiled grimly as she examined the knife Samuel had given her, a beautifully balanced blade that had belonged to his late partner. I'm still afraid sometimes, but now I know what I'm fighting for. During those 3 weeks, Elena also learned Samuel's story, piece by careful piece. He'd been Deputy U.S. Marshal Samuel Garrett, one of the most respected lawmen in Colorado Territory. His partner, Marshal James Whitmore, had been like a brother to him. Together, they'd been tracking a particularly vicious gang of cattle rustlers and bank robbers who'd been terrorizing settlements throughout the region. We had them cornered in Silver Creek, Samuel explained one night, his voice heavy with old guilt. Should have been a simple arrest, but I let my emotions override my training and good sense. James always said that would get one of us killed someday. What happened to Marshal Whitmore? Elena asked gently. James died because I made a careless mistake, Samuel said, staring into the fire. Got myself captured trying to be a hero instead of following protocol. The gang used me as bait to lure James into a trap. He came for me, just like they knew he would. Just like I knew he would. Elena felt her heartache for this strong, good man who'd been carrying such terrible guilt. It wasn't your fault, Samuel. You couldn't have known. But I should have, Samuel interrupted firmly, and the worst part came later. I found out that Sheriff Cain had been protecting that gang in exchange for a cut of their profits. He'd been feeding them information about martial movements, warning them about raids. James died because Cain sold him out for money. Elena felt pieces clicking into place like a well-made lock. So you tried to report Cain's corruption. I tried, but Cain had friends in high places, political connections I couldn't match. He made it look like I was the corrupt one, like I'd been taking bribes and had gotten my partner killed through my own criminal activities. Had my badge stripped and a warrant issued for my arrest on false charges? That's when you came up here to hide, Elena said with understanding. I came up here to survive and plan, Samuel corrected. I've been watching Cain from a distance for 3 years, documenting his crimes, gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment and the right opportunity to bring him down. He looked directly at Elena, and she saw something fierce and determined in his eyes. Maybe that moment just walked into my life. What do you mean? Elena asked, though her heart was already racing with possibilities. I mean, you're not the only person who wants Donovan Kane to pay for his crimes, Samuel said. And together, we might actually have the power to make it happen. But it won't be easy or safe. Kane has allies, resources, and men who follow his orders without question. Elena felt something bright and fierce kindle in her chest like a newly lit flame. For the first time since they'd thrown her off Hangman's Bluff, she felt like she had a real purpose beyond just staying alive. I don't want easy or safe, Elena said firmly. I want justice. And I want to make sure Kane never hurts another innocent person. Over the following days, Samuel showed Elena a carefully hidden trunk filled with documents he'd been collecting for years. Evidence of bribes, records of suspicious deaths, sworn statements from witnesses who'd been too terrified to speak up while Kane was in power. It was damning evidence that could destroy Kane's empire of corruption, but only if they could get someone in authority to listen before Kane silenced them permanently. There's a territorial judge coming through Silver Creek next month for the spring circuit court, Samuel explained. Judge William Harrison. I served under him when I was a marshal. He's one of the few completely honest men in territorial government. If we can get this evidence to him before Kane knows what's happening, we might actually have a chance. Elena nodded, but she was already forming her own plans. She'd been thinking about her stepfather Diego, about the look of fear and guilt in his eyes when he'd taken Kane's blood money. Diego was weak and selfish, but he wasn't evil to his core. If she could get to him first, convince him to testify about what Kane had paid him to do, it would add crucial weight to their case. There's something else, Elena said carefully. My stepfather Diego took Kane's money to have me killed. He's not a bad man, just a weak one. If I can convince him to testify against Kane, to admit what he did and why he did it, that would be powerful evidence. Samuel considered this, then nodded slowly. It's risky. If Kane suspects Diego might talk, he'll have him killed without hesitation. But you're right. A confession from someone who was directly involved in the conspiracy would be devastating evidence. They spent the remaining weeks planning their strategy down to the smallest detail. Elena would return to Silver Creek during the circuit court session, when the town would be crowded with visitors and witnesses. She would confront Kane publicly, forcing him to explain why he'd tried to have her murdered. Meanwhile, Samuel would present his evidence to Judge Harrison. It's dangerous as hell, Samuel warned her repeatedly. Kane's not going to roll over and surrender. He's got deputies who follow his orders without question, and he's convinced most of the town that he's their protector against lawlessness. Some people might not believe your story, especially since you've been presumed dead for weeks. Then we'll have to make them believe, Elena said with steel in her voice. The night before they were scheduled to leave their mountain sanctuary, Elena stood outside the cabin, looking up at the brilliant stars that seemed close enough to touch. The mountain had saved her life, taught her to fight, and given her the strength she never knew she possessed. But now it was time to face the civilized world again, not as a victim, but as a warrior for justice. You ready for this? Samuel asked, joining her in the crisp night air. No, Elena admitted honestly, but I'm going to do it anyway. Kane tried to kill me because he thought I was weak and helpless. I want him to see exactly how wrong he was. Samuel smiled, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked genuinely hopeful about the future. James would have liked you, he said quietly. He always said the bravest people aren't the ones who aren't afraid. They're the ones who are afraid but do what's right anyway. I hope I can live up to that, Elena said. You already have, Samuel replied. Now let's go show Kane and everyone else in Silver Creek what real courage looks like. They rode down the mountain at first light, two people who'd been broken by corruption and violence, but had somehow managed to piece each other back together into something stronger than either had been alone. By the time the sun was fully up, Silver Creek was spread out below them like a town that was about to learn what true justice looked like. Elena Martinez was going home, not as the frightened school teacher who'd been thrown off a cliff, but as a woman who refused to stay dead and buried. The weeks that followed Elena's recovery were unlike anything she had ever experienced. Samuel Garrett transformed his mountain sanctuary into a training ground where Elena learned skills that would have shocked the proper ladies of Silver Creek and might just keep her alive when she faced Kane again. Each morning began before dawn with physical conditioning that pushed Elena's body to its limits and beyond. Samuel had her running through deep snow, climbing rocky cliff faces with ropes, and building the kind of functional strength that came from real work rather than genteel exercise. Your body is your first weapon, Samuel explained as he watched Elena practice climbing techniques on a sheer rock face near the cabin. If you're weak, you're vulnerable. If you're strong, you have options. Elena's hands were soon calloused and scarred from rope work and rock climbing, but she felt more powerful than she ever had in her life. The soft school teacher who had been afraid of her own shadow was disappearing, replaced by someone harder and more dangerous. The weapons training was intensive and methodical. Samuel started with basic knife work, teaching Elena how to hold a blade properly, how to strike effectively, and most importantly, how to think like someone whose life depended on violence. Most people hesitate when it comes to hurting another person, Samuel said as they practiced with wooden training knives behind the cabin. That hesitation will get you killed. When someone tries to hurt you, you hurt them first, you hurt them worse, and you don't stop until they can't hurt you anymore. Elena found that she had a natural aptitude for knife fighting. Her smaller size and quick reflexes made her hard to pin down, and Samuel taught her to use her opponent's strength against them. After 2 weeks of intensive training, she could disarm Samuel himself 3 times out of 5 attempts. But it was the firearms training that truly transformed Elena into someone formidable. Samuel's military-issued Colt 45 had seemed impossibly heavy and unwieldy when Elena first tried to hold it. Within days, however, she was hitting targets at 20 yards. Within 2 weeks, she could put 6 shots into a playing card at 30 yards. "You're a natural," Samuel observed with approval as Elena reloaded her weapon with smooth, practiced motions. "Better than most deputies I've known." "I had good motivation to learn," Elena replied grimly. Beyond the physical training, Samuel taught Elena the intellectual skills she would need to survive in a world of corrupt lawmen and dangerous criminals. He showed her how to read people's intentions by watching their body language, how to spot when someone was lying, and how to think strategically about dangerous situations. "Kane's going to underestimate you," Samuel explained one evening as they studied maps of Silver Creek and planned their approach. "He thinks he killed a helpless school teacher. He's not expecting to face someone who can fight back effectively." Elena nodded, but she was thinking about more than just physical confrontation. What about the people of Silver Creek? They've been living under Kane's rule for years. Some of them might actually support him, especially if they've benefited from his corruption. "That's why we need more than just accusations," Samuel said, pulling out the trunk of evidence he'd been collecting. "We need proof that even Kane's supporters can't ignore." Samuel's evidence was extensive and damning. He had financial records showing payments from known criminals to Kane's personal accounts. He had sworn statements from witnesses who'd seen Kane take bribes or order illegal actions. Most importantly, he had documentation of at least 12 suspicious deaths of people who'd opposed Kane's authority. "This is enough to hang him," Elena said as she read through the carefully organized documents. "But how do we make sure Judge Harrison sees it before Kane has us killed?" "Very carefully," Samuel replied, "and with a lot of backup planning. They spent hours working out contingencies for every possible scenario. If Kane tried to arrest them before they could present their evidence, Samuel had allies among the territorial marshals who would intervene. If Kane tried to flee Silver Creek, they had people watching the roads who would track him. If Kane tried to destroy the evidence, Samuel had copies hidden in multiple locations." "You've been planning this for 3 years," Elena observed. "I've been obsessing over it for 3 years," Samuel corrected. "James deserved justice, and so do all the other people Kane has hurt or killed. But I needed the right moment and the right partner. I think I finally have both." As Elena's training progressed, she began to understand that Samuel was preparing her for more than just a legal confrontation with Kane. He was preparing her for war. "Kane won't go quietly," Samuel warned her repeatedly. "When he realizes we have evidence that can destroy him, he'll try to kill us both. Are you prepared for that?" "I'm prepared to do whatever it takes to stop him," Elena replied without hesitation. During their final week in the mountains, Samuel taught Elena the most important lesson of all: how to think like a survivor rather than a victim. "The woman who was thrown off Hangman's Bluff was afraid and powerless," Samuel said as they sat by the fire on their last night in the cabin. "She thought her life was in other people's hands, The woman sitting here now knows that her life belongs to her, and she's willing to fight for it. I'm not the same person, Elena agreed, but I'm grateful for who I was, because it made me appreciate who I've become. Who have you become? Samuel asked. Elena thought for a moment, looking at her scarred hands and feeling the weight of the knife at her belt and the gun in her holster. Someone who doesn't stay down when she's knocked down. Someone who protects people who can't protect themselves. Someone who believes that justice is worth fighting for, even when it's dangerous. Samuel smiled with genuine pride. That's exactly who James would have wanted, helping us bring Cain down. The next morning, they packed their supplies and prepared to descend from the mountain sanctuary that had transformed Elena from victim to warrior. She looked back at the cabin one last time, knowing that whatever happened in Silver Creek, she would never be the same frightened woman who had nearly died on Hangman's Bluff. "Any regrets?" Samuel asked as they mounted their horses. "Only one," Elena replied. "I regret that it took nearly dying to discover how strong I really am." "Better late than never," Samuel said. "Now let's go show Cain what a big mistake he made when he tried to kill Elena Martinez." As they rode down the mountain towards Silver Creek in their confrontation with justice, Elena felt no fear, only cold, determined anger, and the absolute certainty that Donovan Cain's reign of terror was finally coming to an end. The student had become the teacher's equal, and together they were going to change everything. The spring circuit court was in full session when Elena and Samuel rode into Silver Creek, and the town was more crowded and bustling than Elena had ever seen it in her life. Merchants had set up temporary stalls along Main Street, selling everything from farm tools to fancy dresses. Families had traveled in from distant ranches to conduct legal business and socialize, and the Lucky Dollar Saloon was doing booming trade with visitors from across the territory. Perfect, Elena thought grimly. The more witnesses to Cain's downfall, the better. They separated at the edge of town according to their carefully planned strategy. Samuel headed directly for the courthouse with his trunk of evidence, while Elena rode straight down Main Street toward the sheriff's office. She could feel people stopping and staring as she passed, some in recognition, others in complete confusion and shock. After all, Elena Martinez had been presumed dead for over 6 weeks, and her sudden reappearance was causing quite the sensation throughout Silver Creek. Elena had changed dramatically during her time in the mountains, and not just in terms of her survival skills. Gone was the modest school teacher's dress and carefully pinned hair. Elena now wore practical traveling clothes, dark wool pants, a sturdy jacket, and boots made for riding and fighting. Her long black hair hung loose around her shoulders, and there was something in her bearing that spoke of confidence and barely contained danger. More importantly, she was armed. The Colt .45 Samuel had given her rode openly on her hip, and anyone with eyes could see that she wore it like someone who knew exactly how to use it. "Is that Elena Martinez?" she heard someone whisper as she passed the general store. "Can't be," came the confused reply. "Elena Martinez died in that snowstorm weeks ago. Sheriff Cain said so himself." Elena dismounted in front of the sheriff's office and tied her horse to the hitching post with deliberate slowness, making sure everyone on the busy street could see exactly who had returned from the dead. Then she pushed through the door of Cain's office like a woman who owned the world. Sheriff Donovan Cain was sitting behind his desk reviewing arrest warrants when Elena walked in. He looked up casually, probably expecting to see one of his deputies or a citizen with a minor complaint. When he recognized Elena, his face went through a series of expressions: surprise, fear, confusion, and finally cold, calculating anger. "Well, well," Cain said slowly, leaning back in his chair but keeping his hands visible and near his weapons. "Look what the mountain winds blew back into town. Elena Martinez, back from the dead." "Hello, Donovan," Elena said, her voice steady and controlled. She made no move toward her weapon, but her stance suggested she was ready for anything. "Disappointed to see me breathing?" "Should I be?" Cain asked, but Elena could see the tension in his shoulders and the way his eyes kept flicking to the door, probably calculating whether he could reach his gun before she reached hers. "That depends entirely on how much you pay Jake Morrison and Clint Rodriguez to throw me off Hangman's Bluff," Elena said conversationally. Cain's expression didn't change, but Elena caught the slight tightening around his eyes that Samuel had taught her to watch for, the tell that someone was lying or preparing to lie. I don't have any idea what you're talking about, Miss Martinez, Kane said with false calm. Far as I know, you went for a walk during that bad snowstorm we had and got yourself lost. Tragic accident, real loss to the community. Funny thing about accidents, Elena replied, her voice carrying a hint of dark amusement. Sometimes people survive them, and sometimes they remember every single detail of what really happened. Kane's hand moved slightly toward the gun on his hip, but before he could make a serious move toward it, the office door opened and Judge William Harrison walked in, followed closely by Samuel and two territorial marshals that Elena didn't recognize. Sheriff Kane, Judge Harrison said in his formal, authoritative voice, you are under arrest for corruption, conspiracy, bribery, and attempted murder. Kane started to protest and reach for his weapon, but one of the marshals was already moving to restrain him while the other began reading him his legal rights. Elena watched with deep satisfaction as they put iron shackles on the man who had tried to have her murdered. The man who had terrorized Silver Creek through fear and violence for far too long. This is a mistake, Kane snarled, his mask of false civility finally slipping completely. I'm the legally appointed sheriff of this county. You can't just... We have documented evidence of your crimes going back over 4 years, Judge Harrison interrupted firmly. Financial records, witness statements, and testimony from people directly involved in your illegal activities. But Elena knew the real surprise was yet to come. As if summoned by her thoughts, the office door opened again, and Diego Herrera walked in, escorted by another territorial marshal. Elena's stepfather looked terrible, thin and haggard like he hadn't eaten or slept properly in weeks. When Diego saw Elena, his eyes filled with tears of shame and relief. Elena, Diego whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. Dios mío, Elena, I thought you were dead. I've been drunk and sick with guilt for weeks, thinking I'd killed my own stepdaughter. You took Kane's money to have me murdered, Elena said, but her voice held more sadness than anger. During her time in the mountains, she'd come to understand that Diego had been trapped by his own weaknesses just as surely as she'd been trapped by Kane's corruption. I know, Diego said, tears streaming down his weathered face. I know, and I'll never forgive myself. When Marshal Garrett came to see me yesterday, I told him everything. About the money, about the arrangement, about how Kane threatened to destroy the trading post and have me arrested for my gambling debts if I didn't cooperate with his plan. Elena felt something crack inside her chest. Not quite forgiveness, but understanding. Diego had been weak and selfish, but he hadn't been evil. He'd been another victim of Kane's web of corruption and intimidation. The important thing, Judge Harrison said, is that justice is being served. Sheriff Kane will stand trial for his crimes, and this town will finally get the honest law enforcement it deserves. As the marshals prepared to lead Kane away to the territorial prison in Denver, the corrupt sheriff caught Elena's eye one final time. His expression was filled with hatred and the promise of revenge. You think this is over, señorita? Kane snarled. You think you've won something here? There are men who work for me, men who owe me favors. This isn't finished. You're right, Elena said quietly, meeting his gaze without flinching. It's not over. It's just beginning, because now everyone in Silver Creek knows exactly what kind of man you really are. And they know that your victims don't have to stay victims forever. Elena paused, then delivered the words that would haunt Kane for the rest of his life. I survived what you tried to do to me, Donovan. I survived, I got stronger, and I made sure you'd pay for every evil thing you've done. Sometimes people refuse to stay buried, no matter how deep you try to bury them. As they led Kane away in shackles, a crowd had gathered outside the sheriff's office. Word of Elena's miraculous return and Kane's arrest was spreading through Silver Creek like wildfire. Elena could see a mixture of emotions on the faces watching. Shock, relief, fear, and in some cases, anger from people who had profited from Kane's corruption. Samuel appeared at Elena's side, his hand resting reassuringly on her shoulder. How are you feeling? He asked quietly. Like justice is finally being served, Elena replied. But you were right. This is just the beginning. Kane had allies and people who worked for him. Some of them aren't going to be happy about this change. Then we'll deal with them too, Samuel said firmly. Together. Judge Harrison approached them, his expression serious but satisfied. Miss Martinez, I want you to know that your courage in coming forward made this possible. Without your testimony and your stepfather's confession, we might never have been able to build a strong enough case against Cain. What happens now? Elena asked. Now Cain stands trial, and this town gets a fresh start, the judge replied. I'm recommending that Marshal Garrett here be appointed as the new sheriff, assuming he's willing to take the position. Samuel looked at Elena, a question in his eyes. She nodded without hesitation. I'll take the job, Samuel said. This town deserves honest law enforcement, and I owe it to my partner's memory to make sure it gets it. As the crowd began to disperse and the immediate excitement died down, Elena found herself standing in the street where she'd grown up, looking at the town with completely new eyes. Silver Creek was the same collection of buildings and businesses it had always been, but everything felt different now. The atmosphere of fear and oppression that had hung over the town like smoke was finally beginning to clear. What will you do now? Samuel asked as they walked toward the hotel where he'd secured rooms for them. Elena thought about the question seriously. The schoolhouse where she'd taught was still there, and the children of Silver Creek still needed education. But Elena was no longer the same woman who had stood in front of that blackboard teaching arithmetic and reading. She was someone harder, more dangerous, and infinitely more capable. I think I'll keep teaching, Elena said finally, but not just reading and writing and arithmetic. I think it's time the women of Silver Creek learned some of the skills you taught me. Self-defense, shooting, how to recognize and stand up to men who try to control them through fear. Samuel smiled with genuine admiration. I think that's exactly what this town needs. And what about you? Elena asked. Ready to be a sheriff again? With the right partner, Samuel said, looking at her meaningfully. I think I'm ready for just about anything. Elena felt warmth spread through her chest. Not just romantic attraction, though that was certainly part of it, but something deeper. Samuel had saved her life, taught her to fight, and helped her find strength she never knew she possessed. More than that, he'd shown her that even broken people could heal each other and fight for something better. As they reached the hotel, Elena turned back to look at Hangman's Bluff in the distance, the cliff where she was supposed to have died. In the golden light of the setting sun, it looked far less threatening than it had during that terrible blizzard night 6 weeks ago. She was no longer the frightened woman who had been thrown off that cliff. That woman was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about fighting for the life you deserved to live, no matter who tried to stop you. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as Silver Creek adjusted to life without Cain's corruption, but Elena Martinez was ready for whatever came next. She'd learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the foundation for the best thing that ever happens to you. 3 months after Donovan Cain's arrest, Silver Creek had transformed into a town that Elena barely recognized, and the changes went far deeper than just new leadership or different policies. The atmosphere of fear and oppression that had choked the life out of the community for years was finally lifting, replaced by something Elena had never thought possible. Hope. Samuel Garrett had been officially appointed as the new sheriff, and his first act had been to deputize 2 honest local men who'd been quietly opposing Cain's corruption for years. Together, they'd cleaned house completely, rooting out the last of Cain's corrupt allies and establishing new standards for law enforcement that emphasized protection and service rather than intimidation and control. But Elena knew that the real changes in Silver Creek went beyond law enforcement. People were standing straighter, speaking more freely, and beginning to believe that their voices mattered again. The fear that had kept decent folks silent and compliant was slowly being replaced by the confidence that comes from knowing your sheriff works for you rather than against you. Elena herself had become something of a local legend, the woman who'd survived murder, learned to fight back, and helped bring down the most corrupt lawmen in territorial history. But more importantly, she'd become a teacher of a very different kind than before. The Elena Martinez School for Women's Practical Education had opened in a building next to the traditional schoolhouse, and it was unlike any educational institution the American West had ever seen. Elena taught reading, writing, and arithmetic just like any other school, but she also taught shooting, self-defense, basic medical training, legal rights, and most importantly, how to recognize and resist men who tried to control women through violence and intimidation. The most dangerous woman, Elena told her students during one memorable lesson, is not the one who screams and cries when threatened. It's the one who stays calm, thinks clearly, and knows exactly how to hurt someone who tries to hurt her. The school had been controversial at first, with some of the more traditional townspeople arguing that Elena was teaching women to be unfeminine and dangerous. But when three women used Elena's training to fight off a group of drunken troublemakers who'd been harassing them, even the critics began to see the value in Elena's approach. Elena's relationship with Samuel had deepened into something beautiful and lasting. They'd been married in a simple ceremony at the town church, officiated by Judge Harrison during his next circuit through Silver Creek. Elena had kept her maiden name, a decision that surprised some people, but perfectly reflected her fierce independence and Samuel's respect for her autonomy. Their partnership extended far beyond their personal relationship. As sheriff and deputy, they worked together to maintain law and order throughout the county. Elena had been given official authority as a deputy sheriff, the first woman to hold such a position in Colorado territory, and she'd proven herself more than capable of handling the responsibilities. But the most satisfying aspect of Elena's new life was the knowledge that her survival and transformation had inspired other women throughout the region. Stories of the Mexican-American school teacher who'd survived murder and brought down a corrupt sheriff had spread far beyond Silver Creek, carried by travelers, merchants, and circuit riders to communities across the American West. Elena regularly received letters from women asking for advice, thanking her for her example, or requesting that she visit their towns to teach her practical education courses. She'd already made trips to 3 other settlements, and each time she returned to Silver Creek with new stories of women finding their courage and strength. Kane himself had been tried, convicted, and sentenced to 25 years of hard labor at the Territorial Prison in Denver. During the trial, even more evidence of his corruption had emerged, including testimony from victims Elena had never known about. The man who'd once terrorized an entire county was now breaking rocks in a prison quarry, and Elena took a grim satisfaction in knowing that justice had finally been served. Diego Herrera had sold his trading post and moved east to live with distant relatives, but not before asking Elena for her forgiveness. She'd given it to him freely, understanding that holding on to hatred and resentment was just another kind of prison. Diego had been weak and selfish, but he hadn't been truly evil. Just another victim of Cain's web of corruption and fear. "Do you ever regret what happened?" Samuel asked Elena one evening as they sat on the porch of their house, the same house where Elena had grown up before her parents died. Watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. "Being thrown off Hangman's Bluff?" Elena asked. "Being left to die in a blizzard? Nearly freezing to death on a mountain ledge?" "All of it. The whole terrible experience." Elena considered the question seriously, as she did most things these days. "I regret that it was necessary," she said finally. "I regret that Cain's corruption and evil made it happen in the first place. But I can't regret who I've become because of it." She gestured toward the town spread out below them, where people were going about their evening routines without fear, where women walked the streets without looking over their shoulders, where children played without wondering if dangerous men were watching them. "That woman who was thrown off the cliff was afraid and helpless," Elena continued. "She thought her life was controlled by other people's decisions and other people's power. The woman sitting here now knows that her life belongs to her, and she's willing to fight for it and help other people fight for theirs." Samuel reached over and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "James would have been proud of both of us," he said quietly. "I wish I could have met him," Elena replied. "From everything you've told me, he sounds like the kind of man who understood that justice is worth fighting for, even when it's dangerous." He was, and he would have loved seeing Cain finally get what he deserved. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Elena reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she'd been a frightened schoolteacher living under the thumb of a corrupt sheriff, believing that her only choices were submission or death. Now she was a deputy sheriff, a teacher of women's empowerment, and a symbol of hope for anyone who'd ever been told they were powerless. "What's next for us?" Samuel asked. voicing the question that had been on both their minds lately. "Whatever comes," Elena replied. "There are other corrupt lawmen in other towns, other women who need to learn that they don't have to accept being victims, other communities that need to understand what real justice looks like." "Sounds like we're going to be busy," Samuel said with a smile. "Good," Elena replied firmly. "I've learned that I don't like being idle. I'd rather be busy fighting for something that matters." The moral of Elena Martinez's story: sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you becomes the foundation for the best thing that ever happens to you. Elena's attempted murder led her to Samuel, to strength she never knew she possessed, and to a life filled with purpose, love, and the satisfaction of knowing she was making the world a little bit more just. But more than that, Elena's story proved that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about refusing to let evil people define who you are or limit what you can become. Sometimes the brave choice isn't the safe choice, but it's always the right choice. And in the end, that's what true courage really means. Knowing that some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems impossible to win. Elena Martinez's incredible journey from victim to survivor to hero reminds us that even in our darkest moments, we have the power to choose who we become and what we stand for. Her story proves that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about refusing to let evil people define who you are or limit what you can become. Think about Elena's transformation for a moment. She started as a frightened school teacher who believed her only choices were submission or death. But when she was thrown off that cliff and miraculously survived, she discovered something incredible. She had the power to become someone entirely new. The mountain didn't just save her life, it gave her the opportunity to forge herself into the person she was always meant to be. Elena could have stayed hidden in those mountains forever, living a safe but small life in Samuel's cabin, content with mere survival. Instead, she chose to return to Silver Creek and fight for justice, even though it meant putting herself in mortal danger once again. That choice, to face her fears and fight for what's right, made all the difference, not just for her, but for everyone in her community. She chose courage over comfort, justice over safety, and love over fear. But here's what I want you to really think about. Elena's story happened in 1882, but the choices she faced are just as relevant today. Do we stay silent when we witness injustice, or do we find the courage to speak up? Do we accept the limitations others try to place on us, or do we fight to become who we're truly meant to be? Do we let fear control our decisions, or do we choose to live freely and help others do the same? Elena's transformation didn't happen overnight. It took weeks of hard training, painful growth, and learning to see herself as someone worth fighting for. Sometimes becoming the person we're meant to be requires us to leave behind the person we've always been, even when that change is frightening. Elena had to literally die to her old self to be reborn as someone stronger, more capable, and infinitely more dangerous to those who would prey on the innocent. Elena's tale also shows us the transformative power of finding the right partner in life. Samuel didn't just save Elena's physical life. He helped her discover strength and capabilities she never knew existed within herself. He saw her potential when she couldn't see it, believed in her when she didn't believe in herself, and stood beside her when the fight seemed impossible. That's what real love does. It doesn't try to control or diminish us, but helps us become the absolute best version of ourselves. Consider Elena's choice to forgive her stepfather, Diego. Many people would call that weakness, but I think it was her greatest strength. Elena understood that holding on to hatred and resentment was just another kind of prison. Diego had been weak and selfish, but he hadn't been truly evil, just another victim of Cain's web of corruption and fear. By choosing forgiveness, Elena freed herself from the chains of bitterness that could have consumed her. What would you have done in Elena's situation? Would you have had the courage to return to town and confront your would-be killer? Do you think forgiveness is always possible, even for those who've wronged us deeply? And what does Elena's story teach us about the difference between merely surviving and truly living with purpose and meaning? Here's something else to consider. Elena didn't just save herself, she became a teacher and protector for other women who found themselves in similar situations. She used her experience to help others find their strength, their voice, and their courage. That's the mark of a true hero, someone who transforms their own pain into power that helps others. Elena Martinez proved that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the foundation for the best thing that ever happens to you. Her attempted murder led her to Samuel, to strengths she never knew she possessed, and to a life filled with purpose, love, and the deep satisfaction of making the world more just. Now I want to hear from you in the comments. What part of Elena's story resonated with you the most? Was it her survival against impossible odds, her transformation from victim to warrior, her decision to return and face her fears, or her choice to use her experience to help other women find their strength? And what do you think about her decision to forgive Diego? Was that wisdom or weakness? Remember, the brave choice isn't always the safe choice, but it's always the right choice when it comes to standing up for justice and protecting those who can't protect themselves. Sometimes we have to risk everything to gain everything that truly matters. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to find out who we really are. If Elena's story of survival, transformation, injustice inspired you, let me know in the comments below. Share your thoughts about courage, forgiveness, and the power we all have to reinvent ourselves when life knocks us down. And don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Stories for more tales of courage, redemption, and the incredible strength we discover when we refuse to give up on ourselves or others. Until next time, remember, sometimes the mountain saves you so you can save others. And sometimes the person you become after surviving the worst thing imaginable is exactly who the world needs you to be. Thanks for riding along with Wild West Stories, partner. Now get out there and make your own story worth telling.